Have you ever noticed that the people who get hurt the most deeply in these relationships are almost never the ones who were cold, distant, or guarded? They are the ones who loved the most, the ones who stayed the longest, the ones who gave the most freely, their time, their forgiveness, their patience, their tears. If that sounds like you, then what you are about to hear is not just a psychological explanation. It is something ancient. Something that was written down thousands of years ago by people who understood human nature with a clarity that still cuts through to the bone. Proverbs 4:23 does not begin with a casual suggestion. It begins with a command. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Above all else, not occasionally, not when it is convenient, above all else. The writers of Proverbs had already seen what happens when a good-hearted person hands their heart to someone who never intended to protect it. They had already watched the pattern unfold, and they recorded it, not to make you afraid of love, but to make you wise enough to recognize when love is being weaponized against you. What you are about to discover is not just what narcissists do to good-hearted people. It is what Scripture already named, already warned against, and already provided a path out of, long before modern psychology ever gave it a clinical label. The first thing you need to understand is that a narcissist does not choose their targets randomly. This is one of the most important truths you will ever hear about this dynamic, and it is the one that tends to produce the most confusion, because the instinct of a good person is to assume that being chosen means being valued. It does not. Proverbs 1:10 warns plainly, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not give in to them." The Hebrew word translated as entice here, pata, carries the meaning of opening someone up, of making a person susceptible, of finding the unlocked door. And that is precisely what a person with deeply rooted narcissistic patterns does from the very beginning. They are not drawn to your weakness, they are drawn to your strength. Your kindness is not an invisible quality they stumble upon. It is the first thing they assess. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani Durvasula has described this process as a deliberate targeting of empathic traits. The higher the empathy, the more consistent the loyalty, the more forgiving the heart, the more useful that person becomes inside a narcissistic dynamic. What the ancient wisdom of Proverbs called the enticing of the sinner, modern psychology now identifies as the idealization phase, a period of intense charm, attention, and manufactured intimacy designed specifically to gain access to the very emotional reserves they plan to extract. And so the relationship begins, not with your weakness, but with your light. Your capacity to see the good in people becomes the first thing they catalog. Your willingness to believe in someone's potential becomes the first door they walk through. They do not misread your goodness. They read it perfectly, and then they calculate. What happens next is something the book of Proverbs describes with striking precision in chapter 26, verse 24. Enemies disguise themselves with their lips, but in their hearts they harbor deceit. This is the architecture of the early relationship with a narcissistic person. On the surface, warmth, attention, understanding, the feeling that someone finally sees you completely. But beneath that performance, there is a different agenda entirely. They are not learning who you are in order to love you. They are learning who you are in order to know which parts of you they can eventually use. The charm that once felt like intimacy was never intimacy. It was reconnaissance. This is the moment worth pausing on, because for so many people who have lived through this, the memory of that early period still carries enormous weight. The way they made you feel, the connection that seemed so real. Theologian Tim Keller, writing on the nature of love and self-deception, observed that we are creatures uniquely capable of mistaking intensity for depth, of confusing the experience of being pursued with the experience of being known. A narcissist engineers that confusion deliberately. They give you the sensation of being deeply seen, precisely so that when they later deny your reality, you are already too invested in the image of who you thought they were to trust your own perceptions. That investment, that emotional debt, is not an accident. It is the foundation of everything that comes next. Because once the access is secured, once you have handed over your loyalty, your trust, your time, and your emotional openness, something begins to shift. It does not happen all at once. It happens the way Proverbs 5:4 describes the aftermath of a seductive trap. but in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. The sweetness does not disappear in a moment, it erodes, and as it erodes, something else begins. The systematic transformation of your greatest strengths into the very chains that hold you in place. Your kindness was the first trait they identified, and now it becomes the first one they exploit. Not with gratitude, but with entitlement. The same warmth you offered freely begins to be demanded. When you pull back even slightly, you are accused of being cold, uncaring, selfish. You find yourself agreeing to things you never wanted to accept, not because you have been overpowered, but because your kindness has been converted into an obligation. The person who once made you feel chosen now makes you feel responsible for their moods, their reactions, their pain, their needs. Your loyalty follows the same path. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity." That verse describes the beauty of faithful love, love that holds steady when things are hard. A narcissist knows you believe this. They know you value consistency, so they test it. Again and again, they breach your trust, and then they watch to see whether your commitment to loyalty will keep you in place anyway. And for a long time, it does. Because you do not want to be the kind of person who abandons someone during a difficult season. You do not want to be faithless, so you stay. And every time you stay after a betrayal, they receive confirmation that loyalty, your loyalty, has no enforceable limit. Your forgiveness is next. If your kindness was a resource they could draw on, and your loyalty was a boundary they could test, your forgiveness becomes what one pastor described as a revolving door, a passage through which harm can travel endlessly, so long as the right words are spoken afterward. Proverbs 26:11 renders this dynamic with uncomfortable precision. As a dog returns to its vomit, so fools repeat their folly. The pattern is not a mystery, it is a cycle: harm, apology, forgiveness, harm again. And the tragedy is not that you forgave. The tragedy is that your forgiveness, one of the most Christ-like qualities you possess, was never received as a gift. It was processed as permission. If you have lived through this cycle, take a moment right now to leave a comment below and describe the moment you first began to see the pattern for what it was. Your story may be exactly the thing that helps someone else name what they are still trying to understand. Because this is not a small thing to see clearly, and seeing it clearly is the beginning of something important. What happens to your empathy follows an especially painful logic. Empathy, the capacity to feel what another person feels, to enter into their experience with genuine compassion, is not a character flaw. It is not naivety dressed up as virtue. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 12:15, to mourn with those who mourn, and that impulse, that movement toward another person's pain, is among the most deeply human and spiritually mature responses available to us. But inside a relationship structured around narcissistic patterns, empathy does not function as a mutual gift. It functions as a target. A narcissist presents suffering strategically. They cry when it opens doors. They collapse when it generates support. They perform vulnerability precisely when it will produce the most emotional access to you. And because your empathy is real, because your instinct to care is genuine, you respond to the performance as though it were real suffering. You give more. You excuse more. You absorb more. Meanwhile, when the roles are reversed, when you are the one struggling, depleted, afraid, the empathy is withdrawn, not gradually, almost entirely, because your suffering does not serve their narrative, it only inconveniences it. Research in clinical personality psychology, including work conducted by Dr. Craig Malkin at Harvard Medical School, has described this asymmetry as one of the defining features of narcissistic relational dynamics, a consistent pattern in which emotional reciprocity is replaced by extraction, and where the empathic partner steadily loses their own emotional resources, while the narcissistic partner's sense of entitlement grows. What Proverbs called the enemy who disguises themselves with their lips, that is what this asymmetry produces over time. A relationship that feels like intimacy but functions like depletion. And here's where the strategy becomes most sophisticated. Because a person with narcissistic patterns does not only take, they also destroy. Proverbs 11:9 says, "With their mouths the godless destroy their neighbors." The destruction does not always arrive as open cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as a comment disguised as concern, a joke with an edge that is just sharp enough to land, a moment of hesitation before a compliment, a pause just long enough to hollow it out. Subtle erosion. You share good news, and somehow the conversation ends with you feeling smaller than when it began. You achieve something meaningful, and the response makes you wonder whether it was meaningful at all. Over time, you stop trusting your own sense of accomplishment. You stop believing your own perceptions, because the person who once told you that you were extraordinary has been quietly and consistently teaching you not to believe yourself. This is gaslighting, and it is not random. It is calibrated to the specific contours of your self-doubt. They learn which memories to reframe, which perceptions to challenge, which questions to plant. And the more they succeed, the easier it becomes. Because every time you doubt your own reality and turn to them for confirmation, you hand them more control over what you are allowed to believe about yourself. C.S. Lewis wrote in the Screwtape Letters that the most effective corruptions are those that do not announce themselves, that come wrapped in something that looks like love, concern, or wisdom. That observation, written as fiction, reads like a clinical description of coercive control. Because the narcissist's most devastating moves do not feel like attacks. They feel like intimacy. They feel like being known. And that is precisely why they are so difficult to name and so difficult to leave. The silence that follows confrontation is another instrument in this architecture, and Proverbs 10:18 speaks directly to this. Whoever conceals hatred with lying lips and spreads slander is a fool. When a narcissist goes silent, when they withdraw into cold, calculated distance after you have raised a concern or enforced a limit, it is not reflection, it is punishment. It is designed to produce in you exactly the feelings they need you to have: anxiety, self-doubt, the desperate urge to repair the rupture they created. And because you are a good-hearted person, because you value peace and connection, you often respond to that silence by apologizing, not because you were wrong, but because the silence has become unbearable. Each time that happens, they receive another confirmation that emotional withdrawal is a lever that works, that your desire for closeness can be weaponized against your own boundaries. There is a moment in many of these relationships when the person on the receiving end of all this begins to sense that something is deeply wrong, and begins to change, begins to trust themselves again, begins to enforce boundaries, begins to step back from the cycle. And it is at precisely this moment of growth, of healing, of return to self, that the narcissistic person makes their most calculated move. Proverbs 26:23 captures it. Like a coating of silver dross on earthenware are fervent lips with an evil heart. Everything that looked like love at the beginning returns. The attention, the warmth, the promises of change. But the timing reveals what the surface conceals. The affection does not arrive when you are flourishing. It arrives when you are pulling away. It arrives precisely when your independence begins to threaten their access to you. It is not love returning, it is leverage returning. This is where the wisdom of Proverbs becomes not just descriptive, but prescriptive. Because the ancient writers were not simply recording what happened to good people at the hands of deceitful ones. They were mapping a path of protection, a kind of spiritual and practical discernment that does not require you to abandon love in order to guard your heart. Proverbs 4:23. Guard your heart above all else, for everything you do flows from it, is not a verse about emotional withdrawal. The Hebrew word for guard here is natsar, which carries the connotation of watching over, keeping, preserving. It is the same word used for keeping a vineyard. A keeper of a vineyard does not build a wall so that nothing can enter. They build a structure that protects what is most valuable from what would destroy it. To guard your heart is not to close it. It is to become wise about what you allow inside of it, and wise about what you allow to remain when it has proven itself harmful. Proverbs 13:20 extends this wisdom. Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. This verse is not about intellectual companionship. It is about the formative power of proximity. The people we allow closest to us shape us, not only through what they say, but through the patterns they normalize, the realities they construct, the version of ourselves they reflect back to us. A narcissist, over time, reflects back a version of you that is smaller, more doubtful, more dependent, more afraid. Walking away from that reflection is not cold. It is an act of faithfulness to the person God made you to be. And Proverbs 22:3 makes the case with the economy of language that only ancient wisdom can achieve. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Prudence, the capacity to recognize what a situation truly is and to respond accordingly, is not the opposite of compassion. It is what makes compassion sustainable. A heart that does not protect itself eventually stops being able to give. The depletion is not noble. It is the consequence of ignoring the warning that was written for you. Here is what needs to be said clearly. The fact that you were targeted was not a reflection of your weakness. It was a reflection of your depth. Narcissists do not pursue empty people. They pursue people who are full of warmth, full of loyalty, full of empathic capacity. Your qualities were not mistakes. They were gifts that ended up in the wrong hands. And the painful truth of that is not that you were too much. It is that they were too little, too afraid of genuine intimacy, too defended against authentic vulnerability, too invested in control to ever meet you where you stood. Proverbs 31, that celebrated portrait of a person of noble character, is not a description of someone who gave everything to everyone without discernment. It is a portrait of someone whose generosity is structured, purposeful, and directed toward those who can receive it well. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy, but she also laughs at the days to come, because her life is built on wisdom, not on endlessly absorbing the chaos of those who take without giving. The person Proverbs celebrates is not someone who was never hurt. It is someone who learned to know the difference between love and exploitation and chose, with clarity, to give themselves to what was worthy of them. Spurgeon, preaching on Proverbs, observed that the fool is not the person who lacks intelligence, but the person who refuses to act on what they already perceive. You have perceived something. Perhaps for a long time you have known at a level deeper than words that what was being given to you was not what was being claimed. That knowing is not nothing. That knowing is the beginning of wisdom, the same wisdom that Proverbs has been pointing toward across centuries of human experience. Before we reach the end of this, if something here has named an experience you are still trying to understand, leave a comment and describe what it felt like the first time you began to trust that inner knowing again, because that moment is worth naming, and it is worth hearing from others who have found their way back to themselves. The path forward is not about revenge. It is not about making someone understand what they did to you. John MacArthur, commenting on the wisdom literature, has written that the biblical response to those who harm us is not pursuit of justice at any cost. It is the quiet, courageous commitment to walk in our own integrity. Romans 12:19 is not passive resignation when it says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath." It is a releasing of the thing you were never meant to carry. The pursuit of accountability from someone who has structured their entire psychology around avoiding it is a cycle that has only one beneficiary, and it is not you. What replaces that pursuit is something harder and more beautiful. It is the reclamation of your own reality. The decision to trust your memories, your perceptions, your sense of what happened, not because you need someone else to confirm them, but because they were never untrue. Gaslighting works by installing doubt where certainty once lived. The reversal of gaslighting is not argument, it is return. Return to your own knowing. Return to the person you were before the confusion began to feel normal. Proverbs 3:5-6 offers what may be the most sustaining promise in the entire book. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. For so long you may have leaned on their understanding of you. Looked to their responses to know whether you were valuable, whether you were worthy, whether what you experienced was real. That dependence was not love. It was a transfer of authority that was never theirs to hold. Your worth was not determined in that relationship. It was only obscured by it. The path that straightens before you now is one that requires you to make a choice that good-hearted people often find difficult. The choice to protect the heart that God described as the source of everything you do, not because you are closing yourself off from love, but because you are finally taking seriously the command that was written above all else. because you understand now, perhaps more clearly than ever, that your empathy was never your flaw, your loyalty was never your weakness, your forgiveness was never a mistake. These are among the most genuinely Christ-like qualities a person can carry through this world. The tragedy was not that you had them. The tragedy was that you gave them to someone who could not recognize their value. And the moment you stop measuring your worth by the response of someone incapable of seeing it clearly, that is the moment the distortion begins to lift. That is the moment the ancient wisdom of Proverbs stops being a text and becomes a lived experience. Your heart, guarded now with the wisdom you paid dearly to acquire, does not become smaller. It becomes safer. It becomes wiser. It becomes capable again of offering what it was always meant to offer, not to someone who would convert it into a tool, but to a life, a community, and a purpose worthy of everything you carry. You were never too much. You were given to someone who was not enough. And now, for the first time, that truth is no longer something they can take from you.